Good morning. Just waiting a second for everyone to join us. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU, Local Government Information Unit. I'm really delighted to welcome you to another session of our Ask the Experts event series. This is a series of events exclusively for our LGIU members. For those of you who are new to LGIU, we're the UK's biggest and oldest independent local government membership body. We were created by 3 councils in England more than 40 years ago. But today, your council is one of 300 across the UK, Ireland, and Australia that support LGIU and that we support with a full range of member benefits. And our goal in doing that is to support local government, to support you in the vital work that local government delivers every day. We want to make sure that you're informed, that you're engaged, you're connected, that you're listened to. And we hope to share innovation and best practice and research so that you can deliver for your communities. So today's session is an example of that. We have been conducting our annual State of Local Government Finance Survey in England. We also do it in Scotland now, but we've been doing it in England since 2012. And every year we survey council leaders, chief executives, cabinet members for finance, senior finance officers to get their sense of how councils are managing, how they're responding to a tough fiscal environment. And we think it's really important to build that picture so that we can understand how, what the capacity is for local government to deliver the vital sort of statutory services that you all deliver, what the pressures are that staff are faced by, and what kind of sits behind the really tough spending decisions that we know councils have had to make over the last 15 years or so. And as those years have gone by and those funding pressures, as I think you would all, you know better than me, those funding pressures have become more and more acute. We've seen a real, the level of consensus across the sector has grown and grown. People are very clear about what the challenges are. The question is whether we are moving or moving fast enough to meet them. So we've got some insight into that from a couple of different places today. So I hope that you enjoy that discussion, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work that all of you do in your councils. I'm going to hand over in a second to Vicky Davis, who's Director for Local Government Value for Money at the NAO. And then we'll hear from Dr. Andrew Walker, who's our Head of Research here at LGIU. But just as a sort of framing, we're going to hear from each of them. We'll then have time for some discussion and for input from all of you, because we're really keen to get your sense of how these reports chime, how they sit with you. We are recording the speaker input for for people so we can share it with people later, but we won't be recording the Q&A or the discussion. So I hope that will sort of reassure people that I always say, I don't know why I bother actually, because I always say this and I've never ever spoken to a local government audience where I have any sense that anyone is holding back what they really think. But just in case you did want that reassurance, the discussion we won't be sharing, so that you can speak freely, or even more freely than you would normally do in that part of the conversation. And we will wrap up by 11 o'clock. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Vicky. The NAO brought out a really interesting report just last week, looking at many of the same issues around local government sustainability. So Vicky's going to talk us through that. Vicky, over to you. Vicky Davis, Director for Local Government Value for Money at the NAO.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting us. It's been a busy few weeks, I'm not going to lie, but it's nice to come and speak about this report. Just checking, Jen, give me a thumbs up. You can hear me still, okay, and see the slides. Excellent. Thank you. So, hang on, nothing's moving. Okay. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking you through a report that we published last week. The NAO has quite a history of reporting on local government finances. So sort of every few years, we have traditionally produced a report on financial sustainability and what that looks like We also produced a report on local government finance in the pandemic a few years ago. Just to say, I think what this report does that is different, I will say up front, I don't think there are any messages in this report that will surprise people. What our report was doing, though, was to bring together a lot of those messages in one place as the independent spending watchdog, if you like. And much of this is also about the timing of the work. So this has been on our minds for a while. It certainly felt timely to publish this before the next spending review and to set some recommendations for government to be considering ahead of that. I think the other thing that may look different for those of you that are familiar with our work on financial sustainability in the past is the amount that we have in this report on the service pressures for local authorities. And as much as I know people like to delve into lots of detail on the finances, and you have hopefully a fair amount of that in this report, it felt very important at this point and where local authorities find themselves to really bring up the service pressures alongside that. What do these two things look like? And I've just highlighted alongside the report, and all of these have got links to them so you can go off and get them, is to show some of the other work that the NEO has been doing in the local authority service space as well, and some of those areas that we know are, you know, very acute pressures on local governments. So our report on homelessness of last year, our report on special educational needs that came out in the autumn of last year as well. So our perspective is this report serves as quite a useful compendium of quite a lot of work that the NEO has been doing in this space. So without further ado, let's move on. I think everyone knows this, everyone that works in the sector knows this, but we often start here in our reports as to where's the money been spent. And of course, what we can see and what people speak to me about quite a lot is obviously the social care element of that spending growing as a proportion. Obviously, the actual money being spent by authorities. And I would say over the time frame, you will notice in our charts, we go from 15-16 to 23-24. Just on that, couple of reasons. We have reported on the period prior to 15-16 a number of times. We do make reference to that in our report. We talk about what happened to the funding post 2010. But in terms of comparisons and looking forward, we took 15-16 as our baseline, as a point where the way local authorities were being funded and the responsibilities of local authorities was really a little bit more stable than it had been in the years prior. So not to dwell on this one overly much, it just shows the scale of the spending increase over that period. So 21% in real terms. The social care element of that growing. I think if you look across all of local government, and again, our report does do that, I can say a little bit more about that in the Q&A. We're about 58% of total spending is being taken up by social care. But of course, what we have seen in more recent years is where social care, and particularly adult social care, was the biggest financial pressure in town. It's unfortunately been joined by children's social care and homelessness and SEND, which we'll come on to. Before we get there, we do also talk about what's happened to the funding. Now, of course, there are many different ways of representing funding to local government. The one that government uses, as I'm sure people will be aware of, is core spending power. And so it kind of felt appropriate for us to use the same. What government talks about with core spending power, it talks about the cash movement in core spending power. So what this chart is doing, or what we say in our report, is we compare over the time frame what's happened, not in just cash terms, but what's happened in real terms. Of course, the real terms picture looks rather different. A drop, then sort of leveling out, and then a slight increase as you come into 23-24. So over the period, 4% increase in real terms, core spending power. And then the other aspect that felt quite important is what does that look like when you set that against the population and per person? And obviously what you can see is actually quite a different picture in terms of a decline starting to tick back up again in sort of the COVID years, if you like, and subsequently. So again, that's a rather more nuanced picture than is sometimes reported. What we felt was right to include was what had been announced for subsequent years. So obviously the data we had took us up to 23-24, but we knew the funding set for 24-25, of course, in the last settlement, and then what was coming in 25-26. So we put what, you know, still our forecast figures for 25-26. And between 23-24 and that point, there is a proposed 7% forecast increase in core spending power per person. Okay. This, I think, is where, you know, these are the messages that we were pulling out. If you saw any of the media coverage when we published, I think this was one of the key points that came out, and it is an important point. So whatever's happened with the funding, that slight uptick in real terms core spending power, the key point, and I think what everyone is feeling, is that has not kept pace with what's happened in demand for services, or indeed what that demand looks like, and how there are signs of increased complexity. And increased complexity usually means more cost as well. I have shamelessly stolen from Sky News coverage of our report a chart that sets out, in a way we probably wouldn't, but I think is useful for these purposes, just the big increases in numbers requiring services in these areas between 15-16 and 23-24, and you can see really quite stark. You know, obviously that doesn't equate to funding. The increase in EHCP is not the biggest cost pressure on local authorities, but I think it illustrates the point that this is far and above population growth, and this is really biting on councils. And obviously we can talk about the reasons for why those particular services have increased later on if people wish to do so. But at the same time, obviously, as more people wanting to access services, those services are not, there are signs that those services aren't quite hitting the mark in terms of what people feel they need. And there are concerns about the quality of some of those services. I will say some of those services. So the chart here that we have that kind of illustrates the point is around adult social care. So 15% change and increase in the requests for the support, but only a 2% increase in the number of people accessing support by the time you get to 23-24. And before you get to that point, there's actually been a lot of decrease in the numbers that are accessing support. Now, we know there are growing waiting lists for care, and this not exactly this picture, but signs of it can feel very hard to access services at the moment being seen elsewhere. So a couple of examples that we have on the right, in temporary accommodation, far more families in bed and breakfast beyond the 6 weeks limit than there have ever been. It really is at record levels. Delays for people getting their education, health and care plans, and then again that not meeting the target. At the same time, signs that people are very people are sort of complaining more about the services they're getting, more appeals, more uphold rate from the Ombudsman when they look into some of these cases as well that come through to them. The other thing we do in our report is we talk about the impact of the financial situation and all of these pressures coming together, what that has meant for prevention. I think a lot has been said about this. I know lots of organisations are doing work on this, and this is a point that we continue to press and will continue to press. It is not surprising if 77% of that income coming through to local government is going on what we call demand-led costs. It's not surprising that that is squeezing out other services and other activity that may have been carried out previously. Just a point on demand-led costs, we're really talking about the statutory services, the cost that the local authority has to cover, plus financing costs as well. So if you like, not quite fixed costs, because I wouldn't want to imply there's nothing that can be done around them. And I know authorities spend a lot of time thinking about this, but that kind of, this is your statutory plus your financing, what's left after we've dealt with all of that. Our chart to illustrate this is actually around services for children and young people. So the blue bar is actually, let me check this. Yeah, so the blue bar is sort of more spending going on later intervention over this period, the spending on the earlier intervention stuff going the other way. if you set that alongside more people coming through, we start to get the picture of why things are feeling very, very pressured now. Just a thanks to the LGRU for their surveys, because we made use of the last one to just illustrate this point as to where council leaders were saying they thought they would have to make the cuts to make room for obviously the sort of later intervention service spend, and I'm sure we'll hear some updates on where that has gotten to subsequently. So last key point before I dive into conclusions and recommendations here. The report talks about the support that's come from central government to local government, that we absolutely recognise it has served a purpose. So take what I say in that spirit. We are not saying that any of those things shouldn't have happened. That isn't for us to say, actually, or comment on it as government policy and government decision. Our concern, the points that we make here, is actually those things have all served a purpose, but they aren't tackling the problem. And in some cases, they build up risk elsewhere. One example of this would be exceptional financial support. Again, we often remind people that isn't extra cash for authorities. It's coming from somewhere. It's coming from more borrowing, or it's coming from it's coming from capital, it's coming from your asset base, but it can build up risk over the long term. And so we're really pushing that long-term point. Again, we reference another survey, this time from the LGA, that recognises actually, were it not for the EFS framework, more councils say they would probably be in a Section 114 report territory. So again, I think everyone knows this, government knows this. This comes into some of the reforms they've announced and what they have planned, and I'll touch on that a bit with the recommendations. Other short-term support, we touch on the short-term nature of how the funding is announced and allocated. 627, sorry, I'm just distracted by my internet connection being unstable. Announcement coming up, so do shout if I'm glitching. So we talk about that. We talk about how extra funding has been put in in some places, for example, for adult social care. We also talk about how that funding has come, sometimes announced quite late, not necessarily aiding that longer term planning for authorities. And then the other big one is obviously around high needs spending and that overspend and the override, which we know is due to end in 31st of March 2026. And there we've picked up points, we've reiterated points that are made in our special educational needs report, really to emphasise the need for a solution to be coming down the track sooner. So to finish, to share with you the conclusion, I'm happy for others to have these slides afterwards and do have a look. This conclusion is just a lift from what we have in our report. A couple of things I wanted to highlight from it, much of which I've said already. We do refer to the fact that reforms to finance system have been proposed before and been delayed. We link that to actually one of the reasons, one of a number of factors that authorities are where they are in terms of the financial pressures, because the sort of difference between the funding coming and the demand has sort of grown, and not just because more people are asking for services, but also because of some of the more structural issues around how the funding is allocated out. The other thing, the last kind of sentence of 25 on here, is really, again, recognizing the short-term approach that's been taken, and that's served a purpose, but it's done nothing to stop that impact of those systemic weaknesses from building up. And you will see, if people are interested in this, the nod to where we are with local audit and what that has meant in terms of governance, and a governance and assurance gap in the system. So I will finish on this one, what we have recommended, and if people haven't spotted it, the Public Accounts Committee is holding a session on our report with witnesses from MHCLG and the Treasury in early April. But what we are recommending, and we'll see if PAC pick up similar, is that against the backdrop of the reforms that have been proposed, what is needed is much more collective, collaborative thinking from government. Obviously, government departments, multiple government departments intersect into local authorities and require things of local authorities, or they head up the policy for the services that local authorities are delivering. And really that system needs to work much more collectively. The other thing is the system approach. So where we know that this is a huge interconnected system, and sometimes the incentives sit in the wrong place, and that is a problem because it doesn't encourage people to do the things they know they would want to do, but they're not going to feel the benefit, or they'll feel it too far down the line. So again, taking more of a system approach, and that isn't just health, but it's areas like benefits as well, and you know, far more many to talk to. But again, that way of thinking needs to come together. With the reforms that have been announced, we have said, and it's not just funding reforms, there's service reform that's been announced, of course, homelessness, SEN, children's social care. Our recommendation is encouraging government to really set out what the plan for all of this looks like. So what is the transition from here to there? So people can themselves plan, they know what's happening, what's the transition period look like? And sitting across all of that, this is the role of the Treasury and what the Treasury can and will do through its spending framework. Again, we make recommendations to both MHCLG and also to the Treasury in that spirit, so that Treasury's got that framework that's supporting what they are trying to do. I've mentioned override, I won't talk about that. The other one is on prevention. What does the spending framework and what can it do to really incentivise prevention, and also to build in time for evaluating what benefits that is bringing? I will leave it there, conscious of time. Thank you very much.
Vicky, so Vicky, thank you. I was going to say that's great, but I guess it's a great presentation and a great report, but a rather depressing reality that it's reporting. And I think, you know, all of those recommendations are certainly things that we would very much endorse. I'm going to pass over to Andrew Walker, who's head of research here at LJU, to talk about our report. I guess there's not too many spoilers, Andrew, to say that you're not going to cheer us up that much. Still quite a bleak picture. But
yeah, if anyone's expecting a really sort of uplifting few minutes, then might be on the wrong call. But you know, it's not. We do, yeah. We try to bring nuance to this debate, don't we? And we look for positives, and we do talk about some potential solutions. So, right, thank you everyone. It's really, really good to be here talking about the 2025 local government finance survey. I have to say at the outset that I cannot take credit for this work. My colleague Dan Godley has led this project and done a really great job. Getting the survey out there, bringing in all the results, pulling it all together and analysing it. So thanks very much to him. And I just get the privilege of sitting here and talking you all through it. Can I just check that you can all see the screen and it's the slides are working, aren't they?
Yes. Yep, all good.
Fantastic. That's great. Okay, so very quickly. So this is the 12th time that we've done this survey on local government finance. We send it to every council leader, every chief exec, every director of finance and cabinet member for finance across all local authorities in England. So we get a really good coverage. We heard back from 186 individuals, but that represents 150 unique councils across the whole country, across all tiers of local government and across political control. So it's actually a very, very representative survey of senior figures who really know what they're talking about in terms of local government finance. So let's get to the results. So we talked about this perhaps being a slightly grim picture. So firstly, and the picture was very, very grim last year, where we had 10% of councils telling us they were likely to issue a Section 114 notice in the next 12 months. That's gone down ever so slightly. So this year, just 6% of councils tell us that they're likely to do that. Now, that's a slight uptick. That's an improvement, and we should take some heart from that. Still a pretty grim picture. Particularly when we look at the 35% of councils who tell us they are likely to issue a 114 notice in the next 5 years. Now that again is down from just over half, so that's an improving picture, but still very much, a narrative around local government not being out of the woods yet, and that I think will continue as we go through the results a bit further. Here again, confidence in the sustainability of the system of finance. So you can see last year, 2024, just really, really low. I mean, 4% of councils telling us they were confident in the system. That's improved this year. So just under 10% of councils tell us that they have confidence in the system. Now, we can take heart from that, but there's still a long way to go. And you can see there historically how those, we were at a real low point last year. However, within that, when we sort of dig into that a little bit, we see that actually, whilst the overall level of confidence increased, actually most respondents to the survey were less confident than they were this time last year, with just under 1/4 saying that they were more confident. So actually, within that sort of overall shift, the numbers are still actually not necessarily telling a really positive story, and indeed a fifth saying that they report no change, particularly in their level of confidence. So a slight uptick that we can see there, and maybe this is the beginning of a change and an upward trend, which would be good news, but we're still not out of the woods. What are the pressures? So as we say here, many of these pressures will be familiar to all of us, and we've talked about these in previous surveys that we've done over the years. So the additional pressures caused by service demand, and Vicky spoke to that in some really useful, really insightful detail. That's not surprising. We would have been surprised if that wasn't the case. What's, I think, really interesting here is that there are some new additional pressures that our survey respondents tell us they're front and center. And actually, you can see there that they are, in terms of people saying this is a very big problem, the red bar on the left, actually they are numbers 2 and 3 in terms of the number of responses. So the rise in national insurance contributions being passed on by contractors, and the costs and financial pressures associated with reorganisation. So 2 of the major policy initiatives that have been brought in since the general election have really been shown here to heap significant additional pressure on the financial system of local government. So that's quite telling. That's quite significant, I think. Lots of the other pressures there are ones that we are familiar with. That's not to play down their importance, but they have been there and they've been hanging around for a while. Those two new pressures around NICs and reorganisation costs, I think, is quite significant and quite telling. Just to highlight there what some people have been telling us about national insurance contributions. The chief executive of a rural district there saying this has not been fully compensated, and this is an additional burden, and the call there for some legislation to address the problems around profits in the sector. So local government reorganisation, as I just said, has heaped additional pressure in terms of finance. However, we do want to stress that there are views in the sector that this is the right thing to do, that this kind of change is long overdue, that there may be efficiency savings down the line. So it's important to state that this is a nuanced picture. This is not entirely black and white. However, we show here, so we asked some new questions around local government reorganisation. We asked whether people feel councils have been adequately involved in the decisions around local government reorganisation. Just 10% of our respondents said they agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Just 23% said they agreed that local government reorganisation will help to alleviate financial challenges facing councils. 20% told us that the proposed timescales for local government reorganisation are deliverable, and just under 20% said that there has been sufficient clarity surrounding local government reorganisation. So the sentiment here is really quite stark. I think that there is low support across the sector for local government reorganisation as it is being pursued by the government. This is heaping an additional financial burden. It's not being done in partnership with councils. It's being done too fast. And there's not really the clarity around where we're heading, why we're heading there, what the end game is. And so I think this is quite significant, and I think this plays into the state of centre local relations that we have here in England. It plays into the way that we approach local governance, but I think it really says something about the sort of mutual understanding and mutual trust around around funding for local authorities. And I'd be very interested to hear from people in the room their thoughts about this process as it rolls on at quite some pace. This is what some people told us about that additional pressure. So, I mean, tell us what you really think. So rushed, ill thought out, and potentially undeliverable, the last thing we need at the worst possible time, and a bizarre distraction. So this is quite a telling response, I think, to this major policy initiative. However, we should re-emphasise that it is rising service demand that is the greatest pressure on council finances. So I'll rattle through these fairly quickly. So we ask every year what those the greatest pressures are over the short term and the longer term. These are very similar to previous years. So I will go through these quite quickly because it's fairly familiar. So on lower tier authorities, housing and homelessness is that biggest pressure over the short term, which shifts slightly over the longer term, where we see adult social care and other elements being seen to have a slightly larger share of the pressure. People told us various things about housing and homelessness. This will be familiar to people on the call as well. Huge increase in demand, huge increase in spend. A deputy leader of a district council, they're telling us that just under half of their spend is on housing. I mean, that's really serious, and so rattling through it quite quickly because it's familiar is not to downplay the importance. Again, looking at short-term pressures on upper tier authorities, very similar to previous years. Children's services and education over the shorter term, and housing and homelessness. Over the long term, the pressure is from adult social care and children's services. And people told us about social care that this is totally unsustainable, uncontrollable spending continues to cripple us, squeezing out everything else, and resources are prioritised in this area at the expense of other services. So just really serious pressure from service demand there. Councils are, once again, as we said last year, really just taking a whole range of measures to try and keep the books balanced. Almost every council is increasing council tax. Almost every council is increasing fees and charges. Lots and lots of councils, a big majority are cutting spending on services, are selling assets. Many are spending reserves. So really we see, once again, the picture is councils are pulling all the levers available to them. 86% will be increasing council tax by the maximum available. So this is of those who told us they were increasing council tax. Whilst 10% will be doing so below the maximum that is available to them. So when we look in more detail at the kinds of services that are being cut back, again, this is a familiar picture. We see over a third of councils cutting parks and leisure, business support, arts and culture. Cuts there to adult social care and children's services, a slightly lower proportion, but still these are statutory services that are also getting cut back. Homelessness support, SEN services, they're all in there. Many councils will have told us they're cutting more than one of these services. Some will have told us they're cutting back on a wide range. So that's a familiar picture to last year. When people tell us about the kinds of fees and charges and the council tax that they're raising, there are real concerns here around value for money. So a deputy leader here telling us that most residents just want their bins emptied and for their tyres not to blow out on potholes. They don't understand why their council tax is so high and indeed is increasing, but they receive so little for it in terms of services and in terms of the public realm. So there is a real issue here around perception and value for money, and I think leads into sort of discussions around public trust and democratic accountability. When we look in more detail at the kinds of commercial activity, we see that there's a slight reduction actually in the number of councils that are pursuing different kinds of commercial activity, and this is a wide range of activities. But there are perceived risks, I think, involved, and there have been high-profile cases, obviously, of councils getting into severe difficulty around this. So I think that's quite interesting to note that there is a slight kind of downturn in the kinds of in the rate of commercial activity that councils are pursuing, and that kind of appetite for risk, I think, is quite interesting. We published a report on risk management in local authorities just back in January, which I'd urge everyone to go and have a look at. Now, reserves. This is a familiar picture from last year's survey. I think it's grimly familiar because, as you can see here, the picture is the same, that a vast majority of councils have been using their reserves in the past year. Just over half will use them again in 2025. Or sorry, will use them in 25-26. But that means that half will use their reserves in both. This is an unsustainable approach because we can't keep on dipping into reserves year on year. We know that this is happening and this is a real problem. And this highlights, I think, the lack of sustainability in the sector. So, and this is reflected in some of the quotes that we have pulled out for the survey here. So the ability to set a balanced budget without use of reserves is nigh on impossible, a Director of Finance told us. Reserves will run out in the next 3 years without extended funding support. Another told us that their financial sustainability relies upon a fundamental change in local government funding because of that continued use of reserves. So that's a particularly grim part of the picture. However, there are potential options for fixing the system. We've talked about these in various reports and bits of research that we've published over the past year or so. We think there's a lot to be explored here. Some of these are very common. They're not at all radical in other parts of the world, but here we have a fairly limited range of options available to us for local revenue raising, for distribution of funding, and so on. And so we see here that there is lots of support for multi-year finance settlements, the ending of competitive bids for funding, which we know is already in train, things like business rate retention and reforming council tax, very high support. And then sort of a third of councils talking there about how that their support for single local budgets, which is something that we may start to see more of. But there's a real support there, I think, for broadening out the range of options that are part of our, not even actually sort of policies on the table, but just part of our debate and discussion around where local government finance could go and some of the tools that could be available to councils. So these are slightly new questions, but this shows fairly low support for the progress that the government is making towards building a sustainable funding system. And again, fairly low support for how local authorities are prioritised in terms of need for the system. So again, this shows fairly low level of confidence. But when we look here, and here we potentially sort of get back to that conversation about green shoots. So council's telling us that they are slightly more confident than last year in terms of where local government is considered in wider policy decisions by central government, in terms of the transparency of decisions that are made about local government finances, in terms of the clarity that would allow councils to plan their finances accordingly, and understanding within central government of the scale of the problem facing local government finances. Now, those numbers are all still low. I would argue that that's not a particularly rosy picture, but they are significantly higher than last year. And so government could take heart from that. We could take heart from that there's a sort of a slightly more positive feeling within the sector about the direction of travel, even if we are not perhaps yet in out of the woods in terms of the crisis. And just to illustrate that a little bit, leaders telling us that things are still really tough, but the change of government has made a difference. Another leader telling us that the government is listening and working with local authorities in a new way, and it seems more of a partnership than in previous years. Financial pressures remain, however, and one good settlement does not make a summer. So really a sense that there is still a long way to go, and a mayor there of a non-metropolitan district saying, good luck to my colleagues who will need it. And I should emphasize that, again, that the responses here come from across the political spectrum, across the country, and across all tiers, as you can see there. So just briefly to sum up, and then we'll get to questions, because I am really interested to hear everyone's views and to get to the conversation. So we all in this room, we know that local authorities are vital and that they provide these essential services, and that the financial strain due to the broken funding system really makes that vital role that councils play difficult to fulfill, and it creates problems for councils, but also for communities and residents. So we need radical reforms. It's about community prosperity, it's about service delivery, but it's also about actually the health of local democracy. If we can't find ways to fix the system and really sort of think outside the box. We know that there are, and we've done lots of work looking internationally at local government funding systems around the world. We know that there are solutions that do work, and we don't have to just adopt other political local government systems wholesale. There are lots of options, there are lots of tools that help us to build local resilience. So we talk in the report about building in greater fiscal freedoms, about exploring different allocations of tax revenue, different equalisation measures, again, drawing on work looking elsewhere around the world. Really important to better align devolution with reform of the funding system with public service reform. Last year, the government did talk about how these three elements need to go hand in glove. But actually we start to see that they're not aligned particularly effectively, that these have become sort of, the boundaries are blurred, but they are slightly separate. And we know that the funding reform and public service reform is not such a key element of reorganisation and devolution as we argue it should be. So really important that we get back to bringing those elements together. And of course, to improve collaboration between councils and government, which, you know, despite the slight uptick in feeling, is still at a very low level. So with clearer roles for local government, with a clearer sense of where we're going with reform and reorganisation and devolution, more financial support and compensation for some of the big changes that are happening, you know, we can get to a place where local authorities and local areas are thriving and delivering better outcomes for communities. But it requires some real concerted effort and some real listening to and collaboration with the sector. So that's the picture from the survey this year. I'm really happy to take questions. I'm really keen to hear views from across the room, but I will leave it there and just say thank you very much. And I will also add a quick note of thanks to Mike Woods, who is in the room here. And Mike is our leading associate expert on finance, and as ever has been a huge help in putting together the report. So thank you, Mike. But I'll leave it there and hand back to Jonathan for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Again, fascinating. I mean, I guess, a lot of familiar messages from previous years, some differences, which I think are important. So thank you for that. And I'd echo your thanks to Dan, who, for leading on this project, and to Mike for his input. Right, I'm going to throw it open to questions and comments. There's a couple of different